and there's a part of me, even with the whole beer drinking thing with evangelicals. To me, it seems like just a release valve. It's like it's a prohibition. So
Right.
somehow going there, and I don't mean that in any offensive way, but it just is. It's not really my cup of tea sitting around.
Yeah, and also I think America is kind of characterized as kind of a puritanical culture in a way. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but because we do probably like just as much drugs or maybe more than anybody else in the world. But I think that there's this type though, especially with the evangelicalism of, like you're saying, prohibition. So once you get a certain point in your theological freedoms or whatever, and you start challenging some of your doctrines, maybe you start challenging some of the practices too, and so it becomes like a release valve.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that from my perspective, living in America for a long time, but not being from America, I mean, the kind of the British are kind of repressed in certain ways. There's a kind of external boundedness to England, but the British also let their perversities run wild in a way that Americans don't. Americans, there's this sort of I think there's definitely a puritanical bent, and I mean it's in the culture. So it's probably an undeniable ghost in the machine of the American psyche, and particularly with the role that kind of pietism plays in the emergence of American spiritualities. It's really no surprise that all of those kind of release valves get let off. And I understand it. You kind of go into that. It's funny. Last year, I read I don't know how I even got down the road, but I got into a whole bunch of works on perversion and perversity. Amy Hollywood, I don't know if you know.
No.
She's a really interesting writer. She has this book called Sensible Ecstasy.
Okay.
It's a reflection. I think she teaches a lot on female mystics.
Okay.
But out of that, there were all of the kind of sublimations and things that the mystics got up to, and that led me into this whole other world of thinking about the role that perversion and repression plays in life and even in theology. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that actually might be a good kind of segue into just talking about art as like a type of sublimation, maybe. I don't know.
I mean, it's interesting. Well, I've been doing this little series based on Freud's palliatives,
Right.
or his notion of the palliatives, and art as this means by which we nullify or get away from the harshness of life. So I don't know if art is a sublimation tool. I mean, Nietzsche says we have it to so we don't have to deal with the truth, so we don't have to face the truth of mortality. So the gods gave us beauty as a kind of distraction. So I guess that feeds into Freud's notion of art as a kind of palliative, to give us respite from the ugliness of life. And there's no doubt that we like to surround ourselves with beauty. And there's that strange dynamic of, the beauty of nature, but the cycle of decay that goes with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems always a constant, but it's a constant because of the cycle of life and death. Cheery for a Saturday, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not quite. I also am not sure if I buy into art as being necessarily exclusively a palliative or something sublimating, where it's just a cover over or a kind of an escape for the traumas of life. I think actually, like good theology, good art might actually open yourself into life a little bit, to see life from another perspective.
Yeah, and I think, I think Freud makes reference to that, but Freud tends to be Freud's can be read quite dogmatically. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And his sort of declarative statements are, you know, at least in his mind, or at least in the way he's translated. It's a bit like, I think Freud gets translated a lot like Paul. You know, like his interpreters are much clearer about his lines of demarcation than he may have been. But I mean, I think there's a role. There's no doubt in my mind. Well, from my own experience, there's nothing I like more than to immerse myself in art of some form or another. And quite often at times of struggle, you know, despair, anxiety, depression, which, you know, happen. I mean, I'll go to art as a way of just processing that. You know what I mean? Whether it's visual art or music or something. But I mean, my life has definitely been enhanced by my relationship to the arts. But I don't think it's all just escape from harshness. Sometimes, as you said, you go because it opens you up into the wonder of it all. You know?
Yeah. You just made a post today on your Patreon about Carl Nosgard. Is that the author? And his Seasons Quartet. And in that post you talked about how there was just some lines that like made you weep, and you felt yourself having tears for some of his work. And like for that kind of stuff, that makes me think that like, yeah, I mean, art itself can evoke a type of trauma for people, you know, like not necessarily like a psychological trauma, but it can re-evoke images or certain thoughts or certain memories of things, or just an emotion in the reading or in the listening to a music piece or something that does open you up to the world, that is not something that's necessarily beautiful in the sense of like an escape, but it's something that kind of like draws you further into the world and into yourself more.
Yeah, which I think is what's the amazing thing about it. I mean, I would say I've said on more than one occasion that if I have any kind of church at all, music is my church. And I think before anything for me, there was, you know, music, and you know, the whole sort of mythic tale of music, you know, Orpheus going into the underworld and enchanting the gods, but then at the last minute, you know, looking back, and he sort of becomes this figure who transgresses boundaries and can go anywhere and bring this kind of magic to life and to the world. And, you know, after he loses his wife to the underworld forever, because he looks back, you know, he sort of removes himself from civilization and goes out into nature and just plays, you know. To me, all of that is embedded in art, in its ability really to put you where I differ a little bit from Freud, and it's not like a complete disagreement. I think there's validity to the notion of art as this palliative, you know, but there's also this thing where, at least for me, art sort of places me firmly in the material world and gives me sometimes hope in the midst of hopelessness, gives me a sense of connectedness, even when that connectedness is a connectedness to pain or anxiety. You know, I try not to actually run away from life too much. You know, I think we all have moments where we just wish we could turn it all off. But mostly when I feel those things, I turn to art, not to turn the feelings off. Maybe sometimes to amplify them so that I can come to terms with them more. I don't know. You know, it's an interesting thing. And of course, everybody has different feelings about art and what they like and what they don't like and what appeals to them and what doesn't. appeal to them, and it's so incredibly subjective.
Right. No, I think that's true. I mean, there are times in my life where I feel like turning things off is a good thing. And, but I'm always like from morning till evening, I'm listening to music. I just with headphones, or I listen to music before I go to bed with my headphones. I always have since I was a little kid. It's something that calms me down, and it's not that I can't necessarily be alone with my own thoughts. Although occasionally I find myself like, well, this is a little bit uncomfortable thinking by myself without having music on or something going on. But I think it's just like it's something that is so readily available now with technology. I mean, I don't have to learn how to play an instrument to listen to music, or even know how to sing. I can just push a couple buttons on my iPod, and there it is.
It's kind of that whole aspect is really amazing to me. And this is going to sound really nuts, probably, but I actually think silence is a little overrated. Especially, in spiritual world, they sort of champion silence as the sort of pinnacle achievement.
Meditation and all of that, yeah.
Yeah, and
quietness.
And I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I think that's true for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think learning how to handle noise is just as good of a virtue. To me, there's something, and maybe this taps into that whole notion of Freud's critique of religion, that it's this escape route.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always that getaway clause in Christianity, particularly the kind of largely evangelical, well, even the more mainline forms, it's like it's retreat, it's removal, it's the elevation of removal from the noise of life, and I'm actually the reverse. I want to come down the mountain, not go up it.
Right.
I'm a post-transfiguration follower.
You've seen the light and you're headed the other way.
Yeah, well, kind of. Well, I saw the cloud on the mountain and decided to come down where the demons are.
Yeah, right. They're making the better music.
But maybe I'm in good company. You know what I mean? But
yeah.
And it's not that I don't prize moments of silence, and I spend quite a lot of time alone. So, and quite often when I'm alone, I can like edit out all. I don't need music or this or that or the other, but I don't see it as any particular virtue to be able to live without this or that or the other. And anyway, what's silence? It's just a different kind of noise.
I think so. There's always that internal noise going on whenever you're trying to be silent. I mean, that's the whole goal of some forms of meditation, is to kind of even not only silence your external stimuli coming in, but also the internal stimuli that are to kind of strengthen up your mind muscle, so to speak. And I've actually found the kind of like the centering practices being more prevalent within like mainline progressive Christianity, which is more open towards other religious practices than evangelicalism is, right? But the form of evangelicalism that it took for me was just quiet time with reading your Bible and studying, right? So you, God, and the Bible are hanging out together and contemplating on those things. But Catherine Keller riffs on this a little bit. James Joyce's notion of the chaosmos, right? Where and new materialist thinkers are talking about this a little bit too. Or maybe I'm just making connections that aren't there yet. But this idea that the reality, the cosmos is a chaotic ordering system. It's a system that makes order out of chaos.
Yeah.
And I think that I don't see like reality asking for like a timeout for a second to kind of gather its wits about itself. And I don't know, maybe I'm being facetious here, but I think there is some truth to this idea of finding meaning within the chaos of our social worlds.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I don't want to pit one thing against another, because I think there are some moments where those things are probably really, really good for you. But it's a bit like there's this whole thing about like when people give up technology for Lent. for instance. To me, the question isn't giving it up as much as understanding what we're becoming because of it, and addressing that issue.
Yeah.
It's like when and we've probably all done this. You go on a diet. Well, a diet is just a timeout from regular eating. And generally, the reason diets don't work is because the minute the diet stops, you go back to eating the way that you used to eat. So, they'll tell you that you have to reframe the way you think about food, not just not eat it. And I think sometimes we do that a little bit with our spiritual practices. We just sort of take these timeouts from things, and fair enough. But I wonder if really that's enough to make any dent in what we're trying to do. And anyway, it's always masked for me in the negation of things, which I find a little bit troubling about religion in general. The kind of sacrificial mode. I spent a long time. And I mean a long time. I mull over things for a long time. So, there's this verse in Matthew's Gospel where, look at me talking about the Bible, where Jesus says to the Pharisees, "Go and learn this. I desire mercy, not sacrifice."
Right. And
I sort of sat with that for years, because it's really an interesting thing that. In that instance, anyway, Jesus makes it an either-or equation. That sacrifice and mercy don't go together. That what in his mind God wants is mercy, not sacrifice. And I think sacrifice obviously tends to be very bounded, very driven by what's permissible, what's not permissible, by what's in, what's out, what you have to give up, And mercy is kind of boundary blurring. I think, and for me, mercy is the dynamic called for in the collapsed world that we live in, where the binaries no longer function. I think in the kind of boundaryless world, mercy accomplishes more than sacrifice, at least in a internal kind of perspective.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's an issue there of the law, right? Sacrifice. Yeah. If you have a boundedness, you have kind of some kind of framing. And I don't mean a particular type of law, just law in the abstract, where you have a particular type of framing that sets the limits of what's in and what's out, and what's prohibited and what's allowed. Mercy, maybe I'm not saying mercy is therefore grace, but mercy, maybe it is. But I like that notion. And I also wanted to ask you, we're getting mostly into spirituality here, and it's kind of like looking at the unearthing of what we mean by art. But I wanted to also ask you, who are some artists? What are some works of art, either now or that have touched you, or that have evoked something out of you over your your life of viewing art and submitting and submersing yourself in art that you like to talk about?
Well, the first thing that really impacted me when I was in my late teens, I packed up and went to live in Holland for a while. It was a longer story. I didn't plan necessarily to stay in Holland, but things changed, and so I wound up living in Holland. And I went one time and saw Van Gogh's painting of a pair of boots. I don't know if you've ever seen that painting.
Yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah,
that stuck in my mind since then. There were other, probably more famous and perhaps even more beautiful paintings that I saw, but and I used to go when I was a kid. I used to take the train from where I lived into London, and go to what used to be, it was called the Tate Gallery then. Now it's called the Tate Britain. There's a Tate Modern and there's a Tate Britain, but it used to be the Tate Gallery, where they had essentially this kind of wealth of art, British artists, Constable, Turner, I mean, everything. And I used to go there and just get lost in that stuff. So early on, there was that, that accessible stuff. And I don't know why, I never really went to like the National Gallery or other galleries. I would always go to the Tate and just wander around and just get lost in all of that. And I would always go by myself. So, and when I went to Holland, things opened up, and I saw, Holland is a rich country for art, Rembrandt, Vermeer. I lived in Delft, which is where Vermeer lived and worked. There's more of Vermeer's presence there now. They actually have a museum in Delft now, right almost next door to the place that I lived. But at the time, that presence wasn't acknowledged quite so much. But it was a very arty place. It's where that blue Dutch pottery comes from, And there was Escher. I think Escher, the guy with those really interesting, enigmatic drawings. I think he might have been from Delft, but there used to be a little gallery place there. So that was in that initially stuff. And then I really loved like 60s pop art. I loved Warhol and Rauschenberg and stuff like that. I came a bit later to Picasso, funnily enough. In fact, I just went to there's at the Tate Modern right now, there's a fantastic Picasso exhibit, and it's just 1 year of his life. It's like 1932, and it's a year when he was about 50, and he was kind of world famous, but basically his star was fading a little bit, and it was the year of his first retrospective. But like a whole floor of the Tate Modern is filled with Picasso's work in a year, and it's crazy. You walk in and there's like January the 27th, and there's a painting on the wall, and it's like, oh wow, what an amazing! And then then right next to it is January the 28th.
Wow.
And then you see a room full of art, and it's divided up pretty much into like, January to March, April to May, and rooms full of stuff, and you see just the remarkable transitions and experiments that one guy made, and you go, how is it possible? And you see a couple of paintings that you are really familiar with, and it's like, wow, he really like painted that in a day.
That's amazing.
They don't know if he dated them, when they were finished or whatever. But nevertheless, you got a whole, and it's just 1 year of this remarkable guy's life. But I came to Picasso late, but I really liked, I liked pop art, and I've never been one of those either or people. So I loved pop art and that kind of real and that trajectory. So I sort of followed that through, after Warhol. Basquiat is one of my major sort of favorites. I just love Basquiat, and then but I also like Jeff Koons, who everybody seems to hate because they think he's just over the top and it's not even really art. But I love all that stuff, and I really, 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 really like Damien Hirst.
Yeah, he's a contemporary, right?
Yeah, he's the guy that does all the animal carcasses and the sharks and the fish tanks and the diamond skulls and stuff like that.
Right.
In fact, I'm actually co-writing a book at the moment called "The Aesthetics of Atheism." A/theism.
Right.
And we're looking at the way contemporary art forms handle theism, atheism, and everything else in between. And I've written a couple of chapters in there on Damien Hirst and his appropriation of a religious symbolism in the cause of his own atheistic reflection on the meaninglessness of existence.
Yeah.
Facing death. But I like him. Alongside of that, I love Caravaggio, the Italian
Hmm.
Baroque painter. Mind blowing for me.
Yeah, Joseph told me to. He told me that you love the Italians. You just have a fascination with all things Italian, I guess.
Yeah, I
Maybe
really
not all
do.
things, but
No, pretty much. I mean, I love Italy as a country. I love Italian fashion.
yeah,
I love Italian philosophers. I think Italian philosophers have probably had as much impact on me as the French have on a lot of my contemporaries.
yeah,
Vattimo was my big sort of. He was my man. In fact, that's how it was through Vattimo that I actually discovered John Caputo.
really.
So yeah, I'd read Vattimo, and come across his notion of like weak thought, and
Hmm.
that sort of led me to Caputo's weak theology, and and Jack's done work with Vattimo, but I really like Vattimo Echo. But yeah, so I like the Italian painters. I love Caravaggio of all of them. Really gets it for me.
Yeah, what is it about Caravaggio? I mean, I was going to also ask you, what was it about the Van Gogh's boots that stuck with you over all of these years?
Um,
Or that
well,
remains with you, you know?
yeah, well, and it's really funny because I have a little bit of I don't know if I'd call it a fetish or an obsession, but I like shoes.
Yeah, Shoofies.
I have shoes, but the funny thing is that I really like old shoes,
Okay.
old shoes that are lived in and tell us some kind of a story about the person. It's interesting. Patti Smith, the singer, just posted a picture of her boots on her Instagram, and she's
Yeah.
like got a faithful pair of old boots, and it immediately reminded me of that Van Gogh painting. And I think there's something. I mean, I think shoes are interesting anyway because they're what sort of anchor us to the earth, and I think your shoes. I think your shoes say a lot about you.
Hmm.
Like I used to tell people, never trust anybody that wears square-toed shoes, which you see a lot of. The square-toed shoes. They were like kind of big in the '90s.
Okay.
And they seem to me that they're the shoes that people who don't normally want to wear shoes buy. People that usually wear flip-flops or like Nikes. If
So
they
when they're
have
trying to dress up, they buy square-toed shoes.
They buy square-toed shoes because somehow they look hip, but they're not hip. So I always, I've said to more than one woman that I've known, don't date a guy with square-toed shoes.
Just put enough.
It's anecdotal. I have no research behind it, and
Right.
I'm sure like square-toed shoes will come back in fashion, and then I'll be wearing them. But
Yeah.
but but I really appreciate. I In another life, I think I might have wanted to have been like a shoemaker.
Hmm.
There's just something about shoes. It's what they represent. I think just how we walk around the earth.
Yeah, they carry the load. Like you said, they anchor us to the earth, but they also carry our full load every day, right? When we're walking.
Yeah, and there's just to me there's something really beautiful about a pair of old boots or shoes that have been well looked after, but are really well worn. And most of the time we have disposable clothing because we have fashion, so we don't tend to keep things for long times. But every once in a while you see it, and I don't know, something about those boots. Those Van Gogh boots, they just spoke to me.
Maybe that. Yes.
I think more than boots. They're sort of a symbol of. They felt very working class to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I grew up working class. Where work boots. Your father had a pair of shoes that he worked in, and then the weekend shoes. That was about it. Very much an evocation of a different era, but just the whole notion of life being lived in that. So I think that's what it was.
Yeah, there's something about this contrast, like you brought up about the ephemerality of trends and fashion and
Sure.
and clothing that can just be disposable, and then these boots that have been worn for 20, 30 years or however long they've been kept. I'm not sure, but there's something about like that constancy and consistency that maybe can bring up emotions of longevity or transcendent, not transcendence in the spiritual sense, but like transcending this kind of ephemerality of like everyday changes, some
Yeah.
longevity, maybe duration.
Shoes are interesting because they're made of leather, and the leather softens, but it also ages and wrinkles. And in some ways it's reflective of, without getting too existential, it's sort of reflective of aging and wearing out, and yet still supporting and still moving and still doing the job that they were meant to do. I mean, it's a really interesting thing. I have a few pairs of shoes that I've had for a long time that I wear quite a lot, and they have some kind of meaning to me in terms of like there's a familiarity and a sense that we've been places. I don't know, it's probably bullshit, but
no, I like it actually because to me it evokes a sense of value, that you value something that most people, like when we think of the elderly or people who are aging, we think of like becoming obsolete, right? Yeah. In a lot of ways. I mean, not necessarily, it's not deterministic, but to value that which has been worn and aged and that has grown in a certain way and that has carried somebody through so many years, and there's so many histories and memories and everything tied to them. I just think it's beautiful, and it kind of evokes a sense of
it's funny. There's this really I mean, I don't have much time for the royal family. I'm not much of a royalist, but there's this kind of sub story, and it's about shoes. I remember that in the very deep recesses of my mind, when Prince Charles was made the Prince of Wales, there was an investiture ceremony, and it was on the television in black and white, and he still wears the same pair of shoes that he wore then, and I forget when that was, but it was like maybe 1960 or so. Anyway, it was a long time ago.
Yeah,
in the Prince of Wales, and there was a photo, like someone had done a kind of history of him wearing these shoes, and they were handmade. I mean, they were obviously really good shoes made by one of the English shoemakers, but they did a close up on these shoes, and they've been patched. And you go, well, he's the future king of England, not short of a few dollars. Mm-hmm. But he's wearing the same pair, and there is a thing amongst the extremely wealthy of getting a lot of usage out of things, what I mean? And there's a very English thing that to get things like patched up and stuff like that. But I just thought there was something really beautiful about this pair of shoes that have been with him his whole life, basically, and that even though you could get another pair, it was better to like get these ones patched, literally where the toe had worn it out. They'd sewn a patch in it. I just thought that was kind of remarkable.
Yeah, it makes me think of the history of like who gave him those shoes, right? Like, why are they so important to him? I mean, it was like, what's the connection there?
Yeah, and I'm sure part of it is he's not bound. I mean, he's got his own sense of style, but he's not like swinging from a fashion tree to a fashion tree. So he doesn't need the latest Gucci slippers, to feel okay. And his style is fairly conservative, and those shoes sort of still work in his world. So all of that comes into play. And don't get me wrong, as much as I love old things, I'm a big fan of like new Gucci shoes as well. So
that reminds me. It makes me think of I think it was at MoMA or at Met recently. It might even still be going on, where the Vatican sent over a bunch of like vestments and stuff to the museum there. And,
they used it at the Met Gala for fashion and the Catholic imagination.
Right. Did you follow up on that or look into that at all? Did you see any of the photos at all?
Yeah, I did. I thought it was really kind of amazing. In fact, it's one of those things where you wish you could get an invitation to the Met Gala just to have seen, and I don't know if you saw in the press, everybody sort of had to dress up inspired by that stuff, and some of it was kind of really, I thought, incredible. And there are always the kind of naysayers and the people that like poo-pooed it and stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is, that when you get into the fineries of like vestments, I mean, that stuff is insane, and it's incredibly beautiful. And while it has function, I mean, its function is sort of superseded by, I mean, you don't need gold thread on it, you know what I mean, or all this hand, but you have it. And I think some of the contemporary designers who've contributed to like religious wear, there are more than a few designers, again, most of them Italian, but not exclusively, who've like made vestments and stuff for various occasions for higher ups in the Catholic Church. But I just thought it was an interesting juxtaposition between fashion and religious clothing, which is a fashion in and of itself.
Yeah.
And I mean, the funny thing is that I was in the Episcopal Church for a while, and the vestment thing is not my cup of tea. I like to dress up, but I like to dress up in a way that I want to dress up, and I find something very retro about vestments that just doesn't work for me. It sort of, to me, it locks the religion in another time, and I just don't want to live in that world. And I'm, I know there are lots of arguments for and against it, and I don't really have too much of an axe to grind about it. It just wasn't for me. But I think looking at fashion and realizing how a lot of fashion has appropriated religious symbolism. Some people don't like that. There are always those resistances. It's regarded as sacrilegious or blasphemous or profane. But I also think it's very interesting that those symbols get carried into worlds where religious people think they don't belong. And they are, yes, they're used for maybe sometimes even negative purposes, and I've talked about this before, but I really like that French poet Michel de Guy, and he talks about the need to make revelation out of profanation. After you've made religion out of the sacred, you need to learn how to make revelation out of the profane. Mm-hmm. So for me, an exhibition like that, fashion and the Catholic imagination, really invites some reflection on how you now make revelation out of what has been profaned. I think that to me, that's the game for religion, for Christianity in the 21st century, is to find the revealing in the profanation of what's happened to religion and in the name of religion.
Yeah, what do you think that would look like? Making revelation out of profanation.
Well, I think it probably. I don't know for sure. It's something that I'm spending quite a lot of time thinking about at the moment. I think on one level it probably means that you are. I think in some ways I think that things like radical theology maybe have potentials in that they're not confessional theological perspectives, so they're not held captive to the particularities of dogma and doctrine, so they can go into territories perhaps where non-radical theologies might not want to go. That might be one of the components. I think it probably has a lot to do with the liberating of religious thought from religion. probably.
Yeah.
If I was going to put it in a sentence. And maybe that means just the embedding of the religious in everyday life.
I think that just reminds me of Van Gogh's shoes again, the boots.
Maybe,
You know,
yeah.
something. I mean, maybe the boots aren't profane. Maybe they're more like a mundane. You know, like making a distinction between something that is like blasphemous versus something that's just of the world, that is not necessarily seen as sacred, but can be elevated to a sacred status. Even elevated talks about transcendence, but
yeah. I mean, I find myself, you know, again, one of the things that I loved. If there are links that I like in the art that appeals to me, I think there are elements of the everyday. Like what I like about a lot of Van Gogh stuff is that it was very ordinary subject matter, which at the time was quite profound. You know, there weren't too many, like when he was doing the potato eaters and stuff like that. There were a couple of other French painters, Mallet, I think was a big one, who were painting peasants, but that generally wasn't the focus. You know what I mean? So Van Gogh sort of captured a little bit of working life. You know, Andy Warhol took everyday items that we all used and made art out of them. You know, Basquiat took to the streets, you know, and kind of combined a whole bunch of things. Jeff Koons sort of overinflates little inflatable things. You know, I like Murakami, who does the same, you know, sort of in Japan and all that kind of thing. And that's one of the things that I really appreciated in those Knausgaard books that I wrote about. He just talks about very ordinary, everyday things. And there is this, there's a general, like, when I look around, what I see being advanced is, alongside of well-being and happiness, is this kind of, you can have a big life, and life is an adventure, and life is extra. And you see in a lot of like hyped up, hyper evangelical Christianity, and even that's bled over. So it's just because I think a lot of those divisions have bled into each other now. So a lot of contemporary Christianity is very much focused on this notion that, you know, your life gets bigger with God, and, you know, your destiny, your fulfillment, all that stuff. And to me, I actually, it's not that I want to resist it. I just want to say that the mundane is where the action is. I love adventure. I love the extraordinary. I love the big and the wild and all of that stuff. I love those things. But I don't think that's I don't think that's where life is lived and actually found. I think those are gifts that we get alongside. I like the ordinary. I actually kind of like some of the ordinary stuff, and maybe that goes back to working class roots. I don't know what it goes back to, or if it goes back to anything. I appreciate it all, but I think there's this like drive to make your life into this big thing, and somehow you've failed if you haven't achieved some kind of greatness. You know, and you hear all those words, you know, achieve greatness and strive for excellence and all this stuff, and I'm like, yeah, just try and get through the fucking day.
Right.
Yeah, and, you know, and I don't mean that in a defeatist kind of way either. There's just something, you know, it's like you go, it's like I was listening, you know, sadly, you know, there were a couple of suicides, this public suicides, you know, Anthony Bourdain, who I think for a lot of people seems to have hit a lot of people much in the same way that David Bowie's death did, which I think sort of speaks something about an ability to connect with them that transcended something that is a barrier to other people. And so I was on the train going up to see my mum, and I was listening. I listened to podcast of Fresh Air where they repeated an interview with him, and then another one with Mark Maron. Mark Maron, do you listen to Mark Maron?
I have in the past, yeah.
That's actually the only podcast I listen to with any regularity is What the Fuck podcast. I really like his...
What the Fucksters?
Yeah, What the Fucksters, What the Fucking Ears.
What the Fuckinistas?
Yeah, What the Fuckinistas. I forget, he's got a new one for the summer, but I forget what it is. But Anthony Bourdain was talking about. He said, I'd rather sort of sit down with a simple bowl of sloppy pasta and a cheap Italian wine and some bread. And he's talking about the fact that everything's overcomplicated. You go to a restaurant. He says, and restaurants now are making people pay top dollar for peasant food. And he was talking about, the fascination with bones, cheekbones, and all these new kind of fangled meats. He said, basically what people ate when they didn't have anything else to eat. And they just, we have to find a way to make this tasty. You know what I mean? But he was talking about how it's in his thing. He just sort of sits down with people and goes, so what do you eat and why do you eat this way? And how do you eat,
Yeah. Gotta go?
No. Sorry, I just got a flurry of text there from somebody.
That's cool.
Hope that didn't mess up the thing.
I did lose my train of thought, though. There was something in there about the ordinary and this idea of sitting down and having just a bowl of spaghetti with somebody, sloppy spaghetti. That just sounds like communion to me. Yeah. If you want to give a theological twist.
Well, again, I mean, it used to be right that the Eucharist was a meal. I mean, Augustine wrote rules for what you could and couldn't bring and what you should bring. And it was like fruit and certain nuts. I mean, there were things. It wasn't just the wafer and the wine. That's the reduction.
Right.
It used to be a meal. And it was a meal that everybody contributed to, which is why I think again, we get very sanctimonious about, the elements. Well, what are the elements?
That's a good question.
What are the elements and what constitutes communion? Is it the ritualized act that reduces everything down to this particular moment that isn't even really a moment? You know what I mean? Or is it found in the act of sort of eating a meal together with somebody? I'm inclined these days to go, there's the ritual thing of celebrating communion, fine, but I don't think that's the limit or the end of it either. I think that's a small hint at something much larger. And I don't know, having dinner with your friends certainly feels like something.
I think so. I mean, and you have dinner in all types of occasions, right? I mean,
yeah.
You have dinner for celebration. You have dinner.
Sometimes it's special, and sometimes it's because that's what you do at 6 o'clock.
Right, and that's a liturgy. I think that's a type of liturgy. It's a mundane liturgy, I guess. A mundane, not in the sense of boring, but in the sense of just a regularity.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, food obviously has a big dynamic in religion anyway. I mean, that's not exclusive to Christianity or
correct. Yeah, right.
Judaism. I mean, we're humans. We eat, and we ritualize our food, and we sacralize our food. And some foods are acceptable, and some foods aren't. I mean, and it's kind of culturally arbitrary. Based on a whole host of things. So, go get your lamb burger from McDonald's in Delhi. Don't ask for a beef one. You know what I mean? And it's tied to a whole set of cultural associations and things. I've always thought, it's like we make such a big thing out of bread and wine, and then you go to countries where bread is not normative.
Yeah, you have to have a little bit of cultural translation there.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading who's that guy? C.S. Song, the Asian. I think he's from Singapore, but
not sure.
I think he used to teach at GTU, somewhere like that. He's an Asian theologian, fairly progressive, and he wrote a lot about what to do with bread in a culture of rice. Because you don't think about that. Because you presume that everybody eats the same way that you do. I mean, you go to France, bread and wine's on the table doesn't mean they're celebrating communion, except there is no meal in France if bread and wine aren't on the table. You can eat everything else you like, but if there's no bread and wine, something's missing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and then, but you go to somewhere like Japan where, I mean, now they have a lot of bread and things like that, but that's not a part of their normal cultural experience. All right, I remember the first time I went to Japan and was staying in this hotel, and they had on the menu, they had it said traditional English breakfast. And I don't know if you know what an English breakfast is, but it's like sausages and bacon and eggs and mushrooms and fried tomatoes and toast and baked beans. It's like a big thing, it's called a full English. And so we all thought, all right, well, we'll see what this is like in Japan. Yeah. And so and this is, quite some time ago, and this plate comes, and it's got this bread. It's white bread, but it's about that thick, like 2 inches thick, and it's like a white sponge. Huh. Literally, it's like sponge cake, but like really spongy, like almost feels like plastic. Wow. And they have 2 tiny little bright pink, like finger-length sausages that looked like they were from Pluto or somewhere, and like a barely fried egg. It was like almost in its natural state, that's on the plate. And I was like, oh my God, this is like, and there's no offense, there was something really tender about it that it was on the menu, because it's just not part of their
right.
work, you know what I mean? But you think about that and you go, well, why would they have that there? Why would they? I mean,
tourists maybe.
Well, yeah, but we expect they understand about, Jesus is the bread of life. Well,
right.
You don't have bread in your culture. What is he then?
The rice of life? I don't
know. The rice of life, yeah.
The sushi of life? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, really, you sort of, because we don't realize sometimes how we literalize notions,
right.
symbolic ideas,
We have to make it more abstract. So instead of sharing like bread and wine, it would just be a meal, whatever that meal opposite would be.
The idea of something, isn't it? It's
yeah.
What's it pointing to?
Yeah.
What's it getting at? It's like Caputo. What's happening in the name of God?
Right.
And I think that's true of a lot of religious symbolism. You have to ask the deeper question of what's going on in there. What's it scratching, or what's it trying to scratch? And that could give you a lot of options for how that could be played out.
I was going to say that, but that reduces the role of the religious gatekeepers, right?
Sure.
Which is a good thing, and from my perspective, and maybe for some people they need gatekeepers. They need those boundaries to be set so they know what is right and what is wrong, or what is prohibited and what is accepted. But I think for a lot of people, especially now, I think especially in the United States, but even in Europe, we have the rise of the nuns, the NOES, or just people who are just kind of tired of this kind of dogmaticism.
Yeah.
Who are looking for something else. I think there's something still going on in those symbols, so which is what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and the thing with gatekeepers is, gatekeepers are supposed to shut gates, but most of the time they're supposed to open them.
Right.
And we seem to have got that one wrong. It's like keeping things out rather than letting things in.
Right.
And again, therein lies one of the challenges when you want to reform things, is whether or not gatekeepers can surrender their control over things that give them their power. Mm-hmm. Which is why, for me, again, clerical garb, I think it's actually, and I know some people like it, and even some people outside of religion sort of like it, that people, like Buddhist monks wear orange robes and all that stuff. But to me, it always seems like it's a little bit of a barrier to connecting with people for whom those things are now a problem.
It certainly gets into that kind of literal translation of kadosh or of holiness, right? This kind of set apartness, right? Where you're taking something out of the world and setting it apart, but yet you're in the world and not of the world, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But the problem is that usually people translate in the world but not of it as in the world, announcing and demonstrating your separateness.
Yeah.
Rather than being present in it and bringing something, not just your bias or your prejudice or your againstness,
right?
But gifting that world something that it doesn't. And I know, again, it sounds really. It's hard not to sound like you're just ragging on things. And I'm really not ragging on things. I'm just trying to work out. And from experience, from my own experiences, for the very subjective framework of my last 30 odd years dealing with it all, I'm just going, I think there are fatal flaws in these approaches, and I think they continue to be fatal flaws for a lot of people, and I just want to say, should we just give it a rest and see if we can find another way of doing it? But there's so much attached to all of those things, and I understand that, and I'm not advocating change just for change's sake, but change when it's necessary. And I think if things are going to survive, and I don't even know if they should. I don't know. The jury. I mean, I also don't see them disappearing either. So they are surviving in their own way. But there are those people for whom the current survival rate is not good enough, and they want to think about how to be more connected and more effectual in their engagement with the world and its quest for some understanding of reality. So I don't know. I just lost my train of thought. But.
No, I think that's interesting because it connects me up to this idea of identity. When your personal identity is connected to a particular formation of the socius, you have if and when that socius begins to change, or things begin to crack and fall apart or fall in upon themselves, you kind of lose a sense of yourself as well, right? It's that symbolic death that Zizek talks a lot about, that he gets from Lacan, where your identity is not just in a vacuum. It's not abstract. We're not Leibnizian monads, right?
Right.
So we interact with each other, and we're dialectical. We're interpersonal. We're to use a 20-cent word, perichoretic, right? So we're all integrated with each other, and when that begins to crumble and things begin to change, and you see some of those structures, which in 30, 40 years from now, maybe I'll be in the same position, I don't know, where I feel like I've lost a sense of myself. I no longer recognize this world, and in 30, 40 years, I might not actually recognize the world, if there's still a world around. But but that's all about, but it's really, I think all of that is how you see things. The problem, the challenge is for too often, and this happens a lot in religion. We stick with one view of ourselves and one view of the world, and when that shifts, we don't know how to make the adjustment. I see.
And I think that's a matter of how you understand things, how you understand yourself, how you think about yourself, how you think about the world. I'm not a big fan of generational theory, because the roots of generational theory are in the world of marketing.
Okay.
And in the world of marketing, they're increasingly moving away from demographics, because the idea that one particular generation of people all bear the same characteristics is folly.
Right.
It's just not true. There are some general similarities that people might have, but there are 20-year-old millennial fundamentalists
Right.
You know, they're not all like angsty, you know, no affiliate. You know, do you know what I mean? It's like, so for me, the generational thing is a bit of a smokescreen. For me, it's kind of a psychometric. It's how you sort of look at life. That's the determining. I mean, yes, there are obviously things that a 20-year-old today is experiencing that a 20-year-old 30 years ago didn't, and so on and so forth. But how that 20-year-old and how that now 50-year-old person makes adjustments to reality has a lot to do with how they interact with the world in which they find themselves, and how willing they are to absorb transitions and adjustments to the world in which we live. And sometimes we do those easily. You know, as a culture, we've had very little problem transitioning towards digital embrace. Right. You know, we just took it on. You know, we didn't even know we needed it, and you know, we're all in there. Religion is a lot harder. I think it was might have been Salman Rushdie that said all religions are essentially conservative and want to maintain the status quo. And I think there's a truth to that. It's a sad truth, because I get the feeling that probably wasn't what Jesus had in mind. I don't know. I can't say. Right. My read of it is probably not so much. But, you know, which is, again, why I think sometimes the constant referring to the past is one of the biggest obstacles that Christianity has to overcome. That's not to dismiss the past either. Right. I love history, and I think we need history. We need tradition in a sense. But it's what we do with those things. I mean, I've quoted it many times, and I think it's Picasso, or at least that's how it came to me. Picasso said, you can honor tradition by wearing your grandfather's hat or by having grandchildren. And the grandfather's hat is very much a conservative move. You put on the remnant of the last generation, and there's something very nostalgic, very meaningful, very deep, and very rich about doing such a thing. But there's no new life in that. Right. The new life comes from the babies that you bear. And, so sometimes the appeal to the past is, to me, we have to step out of the shadow of that into the contingency of the present and the future that we don't know. And in a sense, that means the risk of things like heresy or heterodoxy, if you're looking at it from a Christian perspective, you know. And I think that's part of the thing as well. There's like safety in referring backwards.
Yeah, it just made me go back to the beginning when we were talking about palliatives, religion as a type of palliative, right? Yeah. Where that mode of religion seems to me to keep you safe from the contingency of the present.
And again, there's richness there. So it's not that I don't think there are things to be learned and understood. I think that. I think you know, I like history. I like to read what's in the past, but I also know that there's a part of history that can't help me with today. And if I appeal too strongly to it, I'm going to have to do a big dance with it to make it fit. And I think that happens a lot with theology. You know, it's like, I mean, I appreciate Barth or Tillich or whomever, but they're not alive today. Mm-hmm. And their reference points are not the same. And so they can only get me so far. They can help me, but they can't get me the whole way. And I can't I don't think I can, at least I can't. I can't just have a Tillichian view of this or that, or a Barthian understanding. He can inform my understanding, and and help me and resource. But sooner or later, I'm going to have to make my own little leap,
Right.
And assume a responsibility for how I mediate, the times in which I live. It's like the whole debate about like sexuality, which, it's the low hanging fruit. But, in today's world where, Facebook has, what is it, 70 or 100 gender definitions that you can pick from.
Yeah.
You're going to have to do a lot of stretching to work out any kind of theological grid that, historical past to help you process that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that they can't, or that it wouldn't, or that there isn't, but it's not going to give you the whole equation. It's going to give you part of the equation, but we're going to have to add a little bit onto the end of it, I think.
Yeah. I don't see a map that can map that much. That's a large ass map,
It is a large, and maps change. You think about another fascination I have is maps. I love maps. I like them because they tell us the limits of what we know and the horizons of what we don't know.
Yeah.
And, you look at maps. In fact, I was at this lecture a couple of weeks ago. It was at the Institute of Technology and Engineering, and it was hosted by a digital company. It was essentially like a marketing conference, but they had the guy there who's in charge of Google Mapping, and he's an English guy who was like a geography major and really into geography, and he sort of helps Google with all of their like mapping strategies and stuff like that, and you look at digital maps of the world. They're very, very different than older cartography. Do you know what I mean?
They're less set in place. I mean, they're 3D instead of 2D in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and they're they change a lot because they can map if you think about, when someone made a map in the 18th century, it took them, forever to sort of work out what was there and draw it by hand and paint it all up. And now, a Google map can change tomorrow based on information that it's gained and be pinpoint accurate. You know what I mean?
Right.
And also the maps that we use are different because, now we're dealing with a digital world, so we map our lives through social media, so we have a network and a map, like a digital map that's over our life. So our geography has gone invisible. So I'm talking to you. I'm 8 hours ahead of you in time zones. We're in different continents, but there's no time difference between us right now.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Because we're talking to each other, yeah. Live.
We're talking to each other live, and we're sort of mapping a relationship through digitality that's allowing and affording us this thing that changes the way we understand ourselves in the world. Because, 20 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible.
Right. It changes, it kind of dismantles a lot of old sovereignties or old sovereign notions we had about not only what was possible, but what is real or what was real or what could be real about the world. And that's really interesting in how you are illustrating that with using mapping technology.
Yeah. But I really like Mark Taylor. He's got that quote that religion is the most interesting where it's the least obvious. And that's been very much an interest of mine in terms of the whole cultural dynamic within the thinking about things theologically. One of my favorite books of his, I don't know if you've ever, I tell everybody that they should get this book. It's called Hiding. Have you read that book of his?
I don't think so.
You should hunt it down. It's not, it's out of print because it was one of those books that came out in the 90s.
Okay.
When everybody said print was dead.
Yeah.
So they went with all those arty books. So, it's very artfully printed and it's got text going 3 different ways on the page, and there's like 2 different stories going through it.
Oh, wow.
But it's about the importance of surface. And he talks in there about architecture, about tattoos, about skin. It's fascinating. He's
Yeah, I was gonna say the externals of what
Yeah.
meets our senses.
I had I had this like radical theology reading group for about 10 years at the school that I taught at, and we read that book. It took us about a year and a half to get through it because we just, and it's not that big of a book, but we just get caught up in discussing all the things that I like where he'll go anywhere, and I really appreciated that, because for me, and that's a bit like that conversation we had last week about that Anijar essay. You know, the notion that if you're going to think theologically, you have to think outside religion.
Yeah, and that's really provocative. I think that's the most provocative thing about that article, or about that essay, was
yeah, me too.
Yeah, this idea that religion transforms itself. It's kind of amorphous in a lot of ways. Then.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that I thought was a really interesting thing.
Cool. Well, let's go ahead and wrap it up then.
Yeah.
That way you can get back to your everyday life, or I guess.
The mundane.
The mundane, yeah. Finding great things in shoes and stuff.
Make some dinner.
Yep. All right, thanks, Barry, for hanging out with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's do it again. All right, be great. Thanks, mate.
See ya.
Bye. Bye.